Okay, even though I don't see everyone's faces, I see so many of you have been so punctual. I want to be respectful to everyone's time and get started. If this is your first time joining this series, welcome to One Bite at a Time, Emerging Insights in Survivorship Nutrition. I am very delighted to have Megan Laszlo lead this series that she developed. Megan's originally from Atlanta. If you don't know her, she has worked in the space of oncology nutrition for, I think, over 12 years. She'll correct me if I'm wrong. She's also leading our cooking program, Nutrition in Your Kitchen, within our Wellness, Resilience, and Survivorship program. And we really started this series, if it's your first time joining, with the intention of having a short seminar, and this is intended to be maybe 20 to 30 minutes max, and hopefully providing some valuable nuggets of information that will make a difference in our diets and our nutrition and how we're thinking about food. So today is a topic that I personally think is a very important one that doesn't get discussed much, at least not in medical visits. And it's about the effects of cooking and how we cook our food on nutrients, on carcinogens, and a term that Megan's going to discuss, which are advanced glycation end products. Probably something you haven't heard about, but I think it's something we all need to be aware about, and we'll understand why shortly. So I'm here in the background just to help moderate and answer questions. Megan's going to lead us today. Megan, thank you so much. And I'm going to be quiet and be here in the background to support you.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides so we have a visual aid for our talk. Let's see here. Give me just one moment.
And Megan, before you start, maybe I could just send a reminder that because this is being recorded for privacy issues, that's why your cameras have been turned off so that there won't be any kind of violations in terms of HIPAA regulation. But we are still going to take your questions. So please write them in the chat, and Megan and I will build some time for answering Q&A as we go. Again, thank you again.
Okay, that should do it. Dr. Asher, can you give me confirmation you can see my screen? Okay, thank you so much. So as Dr. Asher introduced, the topic is the effective cooking method on nutrients, carcinogens, and advanced glycation end products. For those of you that have just joined, I'm Megan Laszlo. I am an oncology dietitian and the clinical nutrition coordinator for the Patient Family Support Program here at Cedars Sinai Cancer.
Megan, I apologize. I'm going to interrupt because I want to make sure we're starting on the right foot. We have one participant that said that they cannot hear. And I wonder if anybody else from our team can tell us if they can hear, just to make sure that it's just not there. And I just want to make sure your volume is up. I guess others.
I hear you, Dr. Asher and Megan.
Okay. So to those that maybe weren't hearing very well, make sure your volume is up. Okay. Sorry for interruption, and go ahead.
So this outlines our objectives for today, and I wanted to talk about this because how we choose to prepare food can change its nutrient content, by the bioavailability of nutrients, and the presence of harmful compounds. And bioavailability is the proportion of a nutrient that is digested, absorbed, and metabolized. So when we think of cooking, we often think of it as something that causes decreases in nutrients, and that does happen. There are losses that can occur from oxidation, from nutrients dissolving in the water, sensitivity to heat or pH, or a combination of these things. But cooking can also increase the amounts of certain nutrients and make others bioavailable. So there's a variation with food type. For example, here you'll see that vitamin E can be increased by cooking, but also decreased by cooking. But I think it's worth mentioning that certain food components like carotenoids become more available, and their levels can actually increase from cooking. And so cooking carrots is a way to increase the beta carotene, which is the carotenoid in the carrots. Cooking tomatoes is a great way to increase the lycopene, which is the carotenoid found in the tomatoes. And also steaming, in particular for glucosinolates from cruciferous vegetables, is a way to increase that bioactive compound that's found in cruciferous vegetables. Even though fermenting isn't technically cooking, I wanted to point out some of the benefits of fermenting foods because it's a great method for preserving nutrients and increasing nutrient content. Fermenting is different from pickling. Fermenting is when there's a chemical reaction between a food's sugars and naturally occurring bacteria that result in a sour flavor, whereas pickling is when you soak a food in an acidic liquid to achieve a sour flavor. And you can see here that fermenting foods increases the B vitamin content, can also increase polyphenols and short-chain fatty acids, and it can decrease the lactose content. So when you take a product like milk and ferment it, the bacteria eat the sugar in milk, which is the lactose, and then that reduces the lactose content and can make milk more digestible in the form of kefir or in yogurt. So when we talk about bioavailability, the term anti-nutrients can come up. Anti-nutrients are compounds that can interfere with the absorption of nutrients, and these exist in plant-based foods as part of their defense mechanism against predators and environmental conditions. But the presence of these nutrients have led some to question the healthfulness of plant-based diets. So I wanted to talk about a few of these in the time that we have. One that is often looked at is lectins. Lectins are considered often termed as an anti-nutrient, and they're found in a wide variety of plant-based foods. It's been suggested that they can alter gut function by increasing intestinal permeability or causing leaky gut or inflammation. But there's really no strong evidence for this. Really, the only evidence for avoiding lectins appears to be for those with autoimmune conditions, particularly for those with a genetic predisposition for rheumatoid arthritis. And lectins do have a bioactive role. They have antimicrobial properties, immunomodulatory properties, and other health benefits, which are biologic activity that's beneficial. But something to keep in mind is that lectins are water soluble, so you can boil, soak, or soak these foods to decrease the lectin content if that's something that you choose to do. I think it's worth noting that we shouldn't be consuming raw beans. Eating raw beans can cause certain types of food poisoning that we would want to avoid. And also germinating is a great way to reduce the lectin content if needed. So if you ever see sprouted beans at the farmer's market, those have been germinated or are going to have lower lectins. Oxalate or oxalic acid is another anti-nutrient that's found in legumes and leafy greens. This causes a bitter taste, and this is one of the reasons why dark leafy greens like chard or kale have a bitterness to them. It can inhibit calcium absorption, so it does have an anti-nutrient action, but you can reduce the amount of oxalate by boiling, soaking, steaming, or blanching these foods. Usually when folks come to me with a concern about oxalate, it's because they have a history of calcium oxalate kidney stones. But few are at high risk of kidney stones just based solely on their oxalate intake or eating too many leafy greens and legumes. Really, other dietary factors play a larger role, including calcium intake and gastrointestinal health. And we know that eating enough calcium in the diet reduces urinary oxalate, and also consuming citric juice or citric acid in foods helps bind calcium to urine, and then that can prevent the calcium from forming calcium oxalate crystals. So those are some methods to get around the oxalate content of those foods. Phytates are another anti-nutrient that can influence nutrient absorption. They are found in legumes and whole grains, and they can inhibit the absorption of bivalent minerals, zinc, iron, and calcium, but this can be reduced by soaking or boiling these foods. Research has shown that there's really no role for soaking grains or nuts for reducing the phytate content, and soaking these foods can reduce the total nutrients, so it doesn't have a greater benefit to soak those foods. And lentils and peas are naturally lower in phytates, so there's no need to soak those, but soaking dried beans is a good practice. If you choose to purchase canned beans or beans that are in a Tetra Pak, those are going to be naturally lower in phytates. And lastly, I want to talk about tannins. Tannins are found in tea and cocoa and certain fruits, and they're known to inhibit iron absorption. Tannins cause that astringent taste that's in tea and certain fruits that's kind of feels like makes your mouth feel dry. But tannins are also a polyphenol that have antioxidant properties. And so really, I think the only role for trying to avoid tannins is if you do have iron deficiency anemia, you may want to drink tea in between your meals to help prevent it interfering with your iron absorption. So I think one of the best things that you can do to help manage some of these anti-nutrients, especially if you're one that follows a plant-based diet and is eating larger amounts of beans, is to soak your dried beans before cooking. You would want to soak them for about 12 hours, and that's the optimal amount of time to decrease phytates and oxalates, which is going to increase absorption of zinc and iron and calcium. Soaking also decreases oligosaccharides, which are a prebiotic fiber that can cause some gas and bloating. And after soaking, you would want to use fresh water for cooking. I'd like to talk a little bit about food combining, which is really just intentionally eating specific foods together to increase nutrient absorption. And so when we look at our fat-soluble vitamins, we would want to eat those with a source of fat to get better absorption, particularly if you're someone that cooks very light and doesn't like to use a lot of fat in your cooking, or you're doing a lot of boiling and steaming. We want to be sure that we're using good, healthy sources of unsaturated fats like olive oil, avocado oil, nuts, and seeds. And consuming carotenoids with fat also increases the absorption. Carotenoids are things like lutein, zeaxanthin, lycopene, and they're found in foods like tomatoes and broccoli, spinach, kale, and red bell peppers. I think it's also worth noting that if you are taking one of these fat-soluble vitamin supplements, you would also want to take those with food to maximize absorption, and food that has the source of fat. And thinking of nutrients of concern for the cancer survivorship population, I wanted to touch on calcium because we know that chemotherapy, hormone therapy, and steroids all increase risk for osteoporosis, and that breast cancer survivors have a much higher risk for osteoporosis and osteopenia compared with the general population. And so most adults need about 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. And the bioavailability of calcium is generally better from dairy, but using some of the methods that we talked about before, you can see how you can increase the calcium by blanching your greens, for example, or soaking your beans. And when we think about calcium food combining, I'm really highlighting some ways that you can combine high calcium foods with other high calcium foods. So that you can better meet those levels without needing a supplement. So these are some examples up top. Lastly, in terms of food combining, I wanted to touch on the combination of non-heme iron and vitamin C to increase absorption. And this is probably most relevant for those that don't eat meat or for vegetarians. But non-heme iron, or iron that comes from plants or from iron-fortified food, can be difficult for the body to absorb, but combining it with vitamin C helps increase that absorption. So there's some examples here of what that might look like, some practical examples. And it's worth keeping in mind that vitamin C is heat labile, so it's destroyed by heat. So when you add something like lemon juice or lime juice, you would want to use that as a finishing agent to protect the vitamin C. So one of these examples here is blanching dark leafy greens. Maybe you saute them in some olive oil and then finish it off with some lemon juice. And that's going to increase the bioavailability of the iron and the calcium in the greens. So shifting gears a little, I want to talk a little bit about how cooking method can influence the presence of carcinogens. So carcinogens are classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization and the US National Toxicology Program. And we know that carcinogens occur in the environment from UV light and certain viruses, air pollution, cigarette smoke. And we know that they can interact with the cell's DNA to produce mutations and cause cancer. And there are many known carcinogens, but I want to focus specifically on the food-based carcinogens. And I want to also highlight that this doesn't take into consideration risk. So we know that smoking, tobacco increases the risk for lung cancer, but eating processed meat also increases the risk for colorectal cancer, but the risk isn't necessarily the same between the two. There's a much higher risk of cancer from smoking than there is from eating processed meat, even though these are both in the same category of being known carcinogens. So some of our known ones are alcoholic beverages, aflatoxins, which are produced by fungus on crops that have gone moldy. This isn't really a concern for the US. There have been no outbreaks in the United States. This is more of a developing country issue. Also Cantonese, also processed meats that we're going to talk about more in a minute, as well as Cantonese style salted fish, which has been known to cause cancer of the nasopharynx in humans. Also not as much of an issue in the United States. And then we also have our probable carcinogens, which are red meat and acrylamide. Acrylamide is found in foods and tobacco smoke and has been shown to cause various cancers in animal studies. So I wanted to point out this statement from the World Health Organization that was published in January of this year in the Lancet of Public Health. They basically said no amount of alcohol is safe for our health. And pointed out that alcohol is a toxic, psychoactive, and dependence-producing substance and a group 1 carcinogen that's causally linked to 7 different types of cancer. And in thinking about cooking, when we cook with alcohol, we can cook most but not all of the alcohol out of our food. So that's something to think about as well. The processed meats. So to classify and define what a processed meat is, it's a meat that's been smoked, salted, or cured. So just because a meat has gone through the process of being ground up or being ground up and put in a can doesn't make it a processed meat unless it's been specifically smoked, salted, or cured. And processed meat is associated with colorectal cancer and has a strong association, but there's also been associations found with postmenopausal breast cancer as well as pancreatic cancer. And the International Agency for Cancer Research has pointed out that for every 50 grams eaten daily raises the risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. So 50 grams of processed meat is the equivalent of 1 hot dog or 2 slices of ham. And what often gets questioned about processed meat is whether or not these nitrate-free or nitrite-free products are healthier choices. So when you see nitrate-free bacon or prosciutto, is that a better choice? And I think it's worth looking at the label for these products because oftentimes, even though they're labeled nitrate-free, they usually have celery salt or celery powder or spinach extract in them. And those are naturally high in nitrates. And so the nitrate-free labeling can often be misleading. And what's also unclear is that whether or not there's a distinction between home-cured foods and store-bought foods. For example, I could make salmon gravlax at home. Is the risk different for a homemade food versus one that's purchased? We don't really know, but I think it is worth limiting these smoked, salted, and cured foods, if not avoiding them entirely. So red meat. So the red meat is a little controversial. I'll point out in 2015, IARC determined that red meat was probably carcinogenic, and this was related to its strong link with colorectal cancer, but also prostate cancer and pancreatic cancer. What they did not conclude was whether or not the heterocyclic amines, which are caused by high heat exposure, or the polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons, which were caused by smoke exposure, were also associated with cancer incidence. But what we know about these compounds is that they're considered mutagenic, which means that they can cause damage to DNA and may ultimately be carcinogenic or have carcinogenic potential. And there have been research studies looking specifically at individuals' meat cooking method and consumption, and have shown that well-done fried and barbecue meat was associated with the risk of colorectal cancer. But then there's also studies that don't come to that same conclusion. And I think it's worth noting that while there is research that shows that there is an increased risk of colorectal cancer from consuming red and processed meat, there's also studies that show that after a colorectal cancer diagnosis, that eating red and processed meat are not associated with time to recurrence or time to death, and may not show that red and processed meat drive the cancer progression. So I think the takeaway here is that it's okay to have some red meat, but don't burn your meat. I know grill marks are often seen as this very desirable component of red meat. I can't even imagine seeing a billboard for a hamburger that doesn't have grill marks on it. But try to avoid burning your meat, and you can do that by cooking it at a lower temperature for longer, using moist heat cooking methods, or marinate your meat prior to cooking. The last carcinogen I wanted to touch on is acrylamide. Acrylamide is formed when certain foods, specifically potatoes and grain products like breakfast cereals and toast or cookies, are cooked at high temperatures. And this is considered a probable carcinogen, secondary to the animal studies that I mentioned earlier. And I wanted to highlight what our California Proposition 65 warning entailed. So that label is put on foods that are known to cause risk of, or increased risk for cancer or reproductive harm. The thresholds are pretty low. For acrylamide, it's 0.2 micrograms for the cancer warning, and for the reproductive harm warning, it's 140 micrograms, which is consistent for that of the EPA. And so I put a chart here with some of the foods with the highest amounts of acrylamide, so you could kind of see what it would take to get to those higher levels of 140 micrograms per day. Potato chips are notably high in acrylamide, as well as French fries. And surprisingly, prune juice is very high. Dried fruits do have some, but none are as high as dried prunes or prune juice specifically. And you'll also see that coffee is listed there too. In 2019, however, California has exempted coffee from the cancer warning requirement under Prop 65, noting that brewed or roasted coffee didn't increase risk for cancer. Okay, so advanced glycation end products. This is our third subject in this short talk. These are often called glycotoxins. And what they are is a heterogeneous group of molecules. And research on these has progressed dramatically over the past 20 years, in part due to the discovery of hemoglobin A1C, which is a diagnostic test for diabetes and also an age precursor. So these are produced by our bodies. We can also consume them from food sources. And they accumulate with age. They can accumulate with hyperglycemia and oxidative stress. But increasing levels appear to contribute to the progression and complications of chronic diseases, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, renal impairment, and cancer. So they are known to promote cellular damage and inflammation, and these are some of the sources. So today we want to talk about the food-based source for AGEs, or advanced glycation end products. And that's really from the Maillard reaction. And in the culinary world, the Maillard reaction is usually a good thing. It's what happens when you expose sugar and amino acid mixtures to high temperature, low moisture cooking. So when you think of searing fish or grilling meat, that yields a Maillard reaction that causes a lot of flavor and aroma. So some of the other ways that AGEs accumulate in the body over time are from chronic kidney disease. And this is in part because it reduces the body's clearance of AGEs from reduction in a rate-limiting enzyme for the detoxification of AGEs in the body, as well as natural aging, tobacco use, which we know increases oxidative stress, sedentary lifestyle, chronic stress and hyperglycemia, high saturated fat diet, a high calorie, high carbohydrate diet, which can also cause hyperglycemia, as well as high intake of added sugars, specifically fructose. And not only just high fructose corn syrup, but also apple juice, which is high in fructose and normally found in those green juices, agave and sugar sweetened beverages, and also AGEs from high temperature cooked foods. So there's this ongoing debate and research, and you can see articles from both sides. And some are saying age accumulation is a consequence of disease, that it's caused by hyperglycemia and oxidative stress and inflammation. And then other ones are saying, well, age accumulation is really a cause of disease, and the loss of this age-reducing enzyme and increased age consumption from food is driving these diseases, these chronic diseases that are lifestyle related. And so the aim of current research studies on chronic disease is to look at, can diet and lifestyle intervention decrease ages? And there have been some studies that have shown some potential for dietary age restriction, but dietary age restriction alone isn't likely to have a health benefit without exercise, good glycemic control, and other healthful practices. So this is an example of the age concentrations in certain foods. And I want to point out that low age diets are not a part of national kidney disease or diabetes management guidelines. And this topic is really based on emerging research. There's no established upper limit or ideal number for ages that we should be having on a daily basis. Studies have pointed out that the average intake in the United States is around 15,000 per day. But if you're someone that's eating a lot of roasted meat or bacon on a regular basis, you could easily achieve values higher than that. Some research have proposed 7,000 ages per day as the limit. But from me looking at intervention studies, I've seen some use 3,000 as a low threshold and then 15,000 as a high threshold. So really what are needed are well-designed studies with established benchmarks for age concentrations. But I thought it would be interesting to at least see how the age concentrations can increase based on cooking method. So you can see, for example, the raw chicken breast, 3 ounces, it's about the size of a deck of cards, gives you around 700. If boiled, that increases to almost 1,100. But if breaded and oven fried, that shoots up to nearly 9,000. You can see that bacon's very high. Most fresh fruits and vegetables are quite low, even canned are quite low. Even grilled, still not very high amounts, but when you see something like dried figs that have likely been in a dry oven for a long period of time, that's going to increase the age concentrations, as well as the baked macaroni and cheese, which is pretty high, because what are you looking when you bake macaroni and cheese? You're looking for a brown, crispy top, all Maillard reaction. So that's going to have much higher age concentrations. So there are cooking techniques that increase dietary ages, the dry heat methods that we've been talking about, as well as frying, and yes, air frying. The age researchers that I've listened to present on this subject indicated that air frying likely produces less dietary ages than regular frying because there's less oil used, but there haven't been studies that have actually teased that out. And there are cooking techniques that can decrease the amount of ages in our food. And most of these use moisture. So they're steaming, poaching, you're using a liquid base, boiling, as well as the sous vide method. And interestingly, the use of acidic marinades with meat has been shown to reduce the ages produced. In fact, there was a study that showed that beef, when marinated in an acidic medium for 1 hour prior to cooking, form less than half the number of ages during cooking than the untreated examples. So that may decrease the age formation by half. Also, the use of spices has been shown to reduce age formation during cooking as well. So cooking method can increase the nutritional value of plant-based food, and as well as food combining. I think in general, adding citrus juice is a really great practice to consider. And also keep in mind that high temperature dry heat cooking leads to sources of acrylamide, specifically from potatoes, toasted bread, breakfast cereals, things like that. And that grilled meat, when singed or burned, charred, can lead to the formation of HCAs and PAHs, and as well as advanced glycation end products or AGEs. And keep in mind that age accumulation does result from multiple diet and lifestyle factors. So we want to think about that going forward as more research comes out about ages. I want to acknowledge the help of Kimberly Booty, one of our dietetic interns, on some of the research for this. I appreciate you. And we have a brief survey afterwards for short questions. I'd appreciate your response. And I will go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you, Megan. Maybe we could take a couple of minutes and address a few of the questions from the chat. And if there are others, please feel free to chime in. I know some of our team members have kindly answered some. But for the sake of the group, because this comes up a lot, can you share your guidelines on cooking with olive oil and what the upper limit temperature should be?
Yeah, so I get asked this a lot, and it's out of concern that cooking oils at high temperatures can oxidize them, or reach that smoke point where the oil has been heated to the point where it starts to smoke, and that produces harmful compounds. But olive oil is actually a pretty stable cooking oil for the most part. I normally wouldn't want to use it above 350, 400 degrees, just out of caution. And when cooking at higher temperatures, I'd favor, an oil with a higher smoke point like avocado oil as a good cooking oil.
I want to bring up, highlight Alex's question. Should we stop giving Millie prune juice? What do you say?
Well, I think it's interesting. I know Millie's a baby, so I would say use caution with that and think about how often you're doing it. Is that on a daily basis? With all the information presented here, I think the dose makes the poison. And so how often are you doing that? Is it just as needed in an emergency? Or are there other better ways to manage constipation by having more fiber and more liquid in the diet?
Okay. Another one, and maybe we should have another module zeroing in on the microbiome, but it's such a hot and important topic in all aspects of health, including cancer survivorship. Should people be taking a probiotic?
I don't think so. Yeah, I'm on team. I don't think you need a probiotic, except for very specific conditions. I think that a lot of the research has been showing that there's a benefit to high fiber diet and feeding the bacteria that we have in our own gastrointestinal tract rather than introducing new bacteria in. I think when we take a probiotic, especially some of the mixed ones, we don't really know what's going to stick around and proliferate in our gut. I think we're just kind of hoping it will. But I think you get better results from having fiber in the diet and then also having a diverse amount of fiber. So having prebiotic fiber, having soluble fiber, insoluble fiber, and getting it from a wide variety of plant-based foods, not just one source, not just fruit, for example.
I'm going to ask you one of my questions because, as you know, well, I should let the group know. Megan and I, we debate topics regularly. And so my question has always been about red meat. And you already mentioned, for example, marinating with vinegar or citrus can markedly reduce ages. So what would be your guess if we were able to separate out the research comparing those that had a grilled hamburger on a white bun with, a Coke and French fries versus those people that had marinated, slow cooked, grass-fed beef with, an abundance of vegetables? Do you think if the amount of meat intake was the same, do you have a sense on whether there would be any differential on health and all these important outcomes we talk about?
I mean, I think you've isolated the differences in cooking method really well. I mean, the French fries are deep fried. We know that increases acrylamide and some of these things that we've been talking about. But I think that the meat is okay. I think small amounts of red meat are fine to have. I'm not advocating that there's a need for a vegan diet. I think small amounts of red meat, when prepared appropriately and likely from a good source, are an okay thing to have in the diet. And then you're complementing it with the addition of the vegetables there. It's a balance. It's healthful. That's in line with our current guidelines. The fast food hamburger is not.
Thank you. Okay. A few questions from the chat. I think you alluded to this. Is microwaving food safe? Somebody asked that.
I think it's safe. Yeah, I think it's absolutely safe.
Another participant asked about balsamic vinaigrette.
Oh, whether or not, what about it?
It doesn't say. I imagine, well, again, that's a good point. I think if we're talking about balsamic vinegar as a marinade, I'm assuming you're going to agree that that would be an ideal choice.
As a marinade, yes, but if you're looking at it as a way to increase iron absorption from vegetables in the same way that you would use lemon juice, it's not the same. It doesn't have the vitamin C that the lemon juice has. So there's a distinction there.
Okay, one more question from the Q&A, and maybe we could try to answer this in a generic way. One participant asked about the best diet if your stomach is acidic from maybe the cancer medications and regimens. And she kind of conveyed that she might avoid raw foods and most beans, but any general recommendations without knowing any other particulars?
I think if you're someone that's potentially recovering from chemotherapy and having a sensitive stomach, maybe having some acid reflux and just a lot of distress to the GI tract, I think eating small meals is one way to help manage that. And eating foods that are maybe a little bit more bland, nothing deep fried, nothing greasy, nothing spicy, until you start to feel that things are healing, and just avoiding some of those GI irritants, alcohol as well, that could potentially further damage your gut.
Maybe just one or two more. I want to be sensitive to time. And this is an important question that I get all the time about alcohol and maybe having a glass of wine with dinner, because you read research from the cancer arena that you alluded to that relates that there's no safe minimum amount. I will say, there is a literature from the cardiovascular arena referring to heart attack and strokes, where some would argue that there might be some protective benefits. So what do you tell the person in front of you to do? Are you going to take away all the good stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was really interesting that this statement came out from the World Health Organization in January. It was kind of just a mic drop, like, okay, don't do it. And they really argued against the literature for the cardiac benefits of alcohol. I think it's something that needs to be limited. I think in general, we're consuming too much of it. And so, maybe it's the idea that if you give a mouse a cookie, they'll want a glass of milk. But I think it's something that really needs to kind of be tethered back. And individuals need to pay attention to how much they're consuming and how often, especially now that we're getting out of COVID, during lockdown. I can't tell you how often I hear that individuals were overeating and over drinking during that time period. And so I think it's kind of trying to set a new normal and restrict the amount of alcohol that's being consumed. I am hesitant, and I agree with you, to tell anyone that they can't ever have a drink ever again. I haven't gotten to a comfort level with that. I don't know about you.
I have a hard time with that too, and again, it might just depend on that person's individual circumstance. I just want to emphasize one thing you said, because I've seen this personally a lot, where you mentioned the fat absorbable vitamins A, D, and K. As you know, many people, for one another, are taking vitamin D supplements, and I've seen a lot of people literally taking it on an empty stomach. And I want to highlight what Megan said. It does not get absorbed well without some fat. So if you are choosing to take that supplement, make sure you have, I don't know what you would suggest, a little bit of olive oil or cheese, or something with it, with the meal.
Avocado toast.
There are a number of other questions, but I think we're going to take some of these questions and help formulate future one bite at a time topics, because there's a lot of different directions we could take this. I know I wasn't able to see everyone's faces, and for privacy reasons, we elected this format, but I appreciate everyone joining, for logging in, sharing your time. Please do give us your feedback, because we're looking for future topics that would be helpful to everyone. Again, thanks so much. Megan, thank you so much for all the time you took for leading this.
That's my pleasure.
See you all next time. Thank you.
All right, thank you.